my favorite example of similarity are these fragments from Egyptian scribal schools, where you have like, students complaining about their teachers. My teacher beat me. My teacher, is too hard on me, doesn't understand, how difficult it is to a student. And then you have teachers, and this is from like 3,000 years ago, teachers saying, this generation of students no longer really cares about the arts and humanities. I mean, they don't say arts and humanities, but it's essentially this, it's almost like they show the statistics, Mary, that with which you got us started. And so you'd be like, oh my God, this could be written today.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're going to fence with some of the larger, more difficult to quantify considerations in life. But take heart, you all have opinions on this. We know that because of the inbox questions. I refer, of course, to the arts and humanities. In the latest issue of Harvard Magazine, Professor Jim Engel considers what is being lost in the precipitous decline of the arts and humanities. He cites Nobel Laureate and physicist Steven Weinberg, who said, "Science has discovered many things, but, quote, nothing in science can ever tell us what we ought to value." This at a time when interest and investment in the humanities is plummeting, and enrolment in STEM subjects is flourishing. Well, Ted Turner, the very successful businessman entrepreneur who founded CNN, won the America's Cup, established the UN Foundation, began his life by studying the classics and economics at Brown University, much to the chagrin of his father. Turner said that by pursuing ancient literature, it prepped him for business, competition, and philanthropy. So, to help us consider those thoughts and other issues, like should we care about the past and what good are the arts? We've got two wonderful guests with us today. Martin Puchner, a Harvard Humanities professor, has written a brand new book, Culture, The Story of Us from Cave Art to K-Pop. In this, he's grappled many of these questions. And Patrick Bringley worked as a museum guard at the Museum of Metropolitan Art in New York for 10 years before leaving to write a book about his experiences. The book is called All the Beauty in the World. So welcome to you both. Congratulations on the new book. So Martin, let's start with you first. For centuries, you say, humanity has sought to understand and transmit to future generations, not just the know-how, but the know-why, puzzling the meaning and purpose of existence through art, religion, architecture, and philosophy. So why did you write the book, and why is this pursuit of understanding so essential that we shouldn't be safeguarding it?
First, Mary, thank you for having me on the program. And thanks for asking this question. It's sort of embarrassing because I think I started this book because even though I had been, teaching arts and humanities for decades, really, I had never really asked myself the sort of fundamental question in me, what is culture and how does it work? I think this has to do with specialization, and that if you're in the arts, you're already sort of in this world and you take it for granted. You assume that people know what it is and value it. And I think it's because of the fact that now culture is so contested, that there seems to be this falling enrollments and so on and so forth, that I somehow realized in order to actually articulate why we need culture, I need to understand how culture works. And so this is what I said from the goal I set for myself. And I knew that I wanted it to be a global story. I didn't want to retell the old Western art story. I also felt like I needed to start sort of at the beginning, so cave art. And I wanted it to be sort of immersive, compelling episodes. But from them, I wanted to this question, how does culture work actually? How does it evolve to emerge? And so that there are a couple of through lines that, that I took away at the end of the process. I sort of start with this idea that culture is not natural, that, we don't pass it on through our DNA. So we need storage medium and institutions like caves, like museums, as Patrick will tell us, to do that. I started to become very clear to me, especially once you take this long view, that when it comes to art, we are all latecomers. I think there's much too much emphasis on originality and firsts, where you're always confronted with these somewhat mysterious works from the distant past. And so we need to, that becomes a driver of culture. The most important takeaway for me, perhaps, is that cultures thrive by borrowing. That if you look at any given tradition, you see that it is cobbled together from fragments of other traditions. And there are many, examples of that in the book. And I think there's a corollary to that, namely that ultimately culture can't be owned by any single person or group. Now, I know that in today's sort of restitution debate and worries about cultural appropriation, there is this language of art and culture as property, and I can see how in certain contexts that might be important. But ultimately, I feel like if you look at how cultures evolve, and I'm talking about really all of them, you can see that borrowing is just hugely important, and that a sense of ownership tends to shut down possibility. And I think the sort of last takeaway point I took from that sort of global deep history of art course that I set for myself is a certain attitude of humility that many of the heroes in the books are translators, preservers, people who travel, who immerse themselves in foreign cultures, and they all seek this sort of experience of difference. They recognize that these artworks from the distant past or from other cultures they engage with challenge their own values in some important way. And that's what they valued. And I think also because, and some are explicit about it, they all aware, and I'm talking about translators working in the Baghdad House of Wisdom in the Middle Ages, who are interested in Greek manuscripts, even though they were not Islamic, or medieval nuns and monks cherishing pre-Christian manuscripts, even though they're not Christian, and many figures like that. I think they all realize that their own values will also change, and they hope that the future would not judge them too harshly. And I think that's the kind of attitude they also took towards the past, and that strikes me as an important thing to take away. So those are sort of some of the through lines, in a way, I try to tease out in order to sort of have a better answer for myself and maybe for students. How culture, if you take that bird's eye perspective, how does culture actually work, and how does it evolve, and what are the mechanisms?
It's very interesting. It's very broad-based and it's very accessible. It's not stuffy. It's not hard to get into. You don't have to have a PhD. So it's great. It's a nice smorgasbord of different experiences. So let's look at the chart now, to be very kind of depressing. This is a chart that the American Academy of Arts and Sciences produced, which was in the article that Jim Engel wrote in the Harvard Magazine. And it shows over the last 10 years, this massive shift in the number of bachelor degrees that are being awarded. And if you can see at the bottom there, we've gone from religion through all the various liberal arts, music sitting there in the middle. And then we go over to computer science, and there's been this big drift away from the arts and the humanities over to, STEM, engineering, applied fields of science. So is this just about money, do you think? Students might want to study these nice areas in the liberal arts, but they're not sure they can get a job when they graduate. Is it just as simple as that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think this is a complex phenomenon that has many different factors. I think that, of course, students are worried about jobs, and I think it would be, arrogant and idiotic to chide them for it. But at the same time, I'm not sure it's just about money. First of all, these studies, especially the longer term studies, show that actually humanities majors are not doing too badly, especially in the long run. I'm actually always surprised that they're just a little below engineers and so on and so forth. I would have expected a much bigger difference. And maybe we're not good enough communicating that. But I actually think that especially this generation of students, they're actually not, the vibe I get from them is not that it's just about money. They're very value oriented. They want to work for companies that have the same values. Many of them want to be activists. So I don't get the sense that it's just about money, which means that actually this easy story we in the humanities have been telling ourselves, maybe, oh, these students are just worried about jobs, may not be true, may not describe the full picture. It means that maybe we haven't been very good or very effective in communicating what's exciting about culture and the arts and humanities, and that we need to get better at it. And that's at least the conclusion I draw for myself, because I can't change the job market, but in a tiny little way, I can change how I teach. And so this is sort of the conclusion I came to, and this is why in some sense, I embarked on this project to have a better and more exciting story about the arts for students, to give them sort of the big picture that we in the humanities rarely provide, that we always assume that students already know that basic stuff, or that they already care. And I think that we can't necessarily assume that. So I think we have to I think we in the humanities are not always our own best advocates. And I've been trying to teach myself to become maybe a little better at it.
Well, we're going to involve Patrick in that part of the discussion in a little while, because he has got some views on that. In that same article that I was alluding to earlier, Harry Truman is quoted. He apparently said that reading history and biography was essential preparation for leadership. And he himself never actually went to college. And he said it gives people the ability to discern a leader from a demagogue, which I thought was very, very perceptive of him. So talking about how you sell the humanities to your students, perhaps if we were kind of enforcing or reinforcing the value of critical thinking skills, not just in terms of developing your own personal intellect and being fully functioning, but the essential aspect of creating an informed electorate, and how significant that is in terms of the politics of the country and who's voting for what. So maybe if we link what people are doing and try and put a more significant spin on it, I hate to use the word spin, but market it in such a fashion, in the way that they've done very well at Harvard on happiness. Happiness is now the subject of the hour, and they've linked that to everything possible. So you make money, you have meaning of life, you have better relationships, you're fit. I mean, it's the panacea. So I don't want to digress, but going back to the critical thinking skills, are the humanities essential, do you think, for developing critical thinking skills?
It's a term that people in the humanities use a lot these days to say why students should come to us. They're not coming. And so I think in part it's because I'm not even sure we are so good at actually teaching critical thinking. And I think there are actually a lot of other sciences, social sciences, natural sciences, that are very good at teaching critical thinking. I think it's too easy actually to say that we somehow have cornered the market on it. I think we could be, again, much better at it. But, Mary, I think because this term has been used so much and somehow doesn't seem to making much of a difference. I mean, it's possible that things would be worse otherwise, but I've started to use more often a term that some people have used, but is not as common, which is cultural intelligence. And I think this goes back to my project of really teaching a global humanities and to provide a kind of deeper understanding of different cultures. And I think there is value in that in any case, but it's also an important skill for the global marketplace. So I feel like that for me seems to be a more promising path if you want to sort of instrumentalize the humanities. And I think it's okay to do that because I do think that it's true that we in the humanities know about culture and why we can't engineer our way out of all the problems we have in today's world. And so this is what I've been using instead of I think critical thinking is great. I don't know that we in the humanities are better at it than others. And so, but I think that cultural intelligence is something that's very distinctive about what we do.
That's a nice term. I like that. Also, it appeals. Anytime you say intelligence, it appeals to people's ego, like emotional intelligence. Everyone was emotionally intelligent in the 70s. So just in a nutshell, before I go over to Patrick, isn't there a kind of commonality of just searching for meaning in the whole humanities thing, if we're looking at cultures?
I do think that essentially if you try to study, if you look at the arts, and as I did, sort of the deep history of art, I think what you get when you take a step back is sort of a history of, a snapshot of the human species in its quest for meaning and its attempt. And I start with the wonderful Chauvet cave, where you really feel like these humans who worked on this cave for thousands of years in incredible continuity, almost 200 generations, that they somehow expressed. It was very important, devoting enormous resources to expressing and preserving images that clearly express try to figure out their place in the universe, where they come from, how they relate to other species, the world outside the caves. There are some, more realistic representations of animals they would hunt, but also imaginary beings. I mean, it's clearly an incredible space. They never lived there. They just went there generation after generation to figure this thing out, this intergenerational work. And that for me becomes sort of it's my first chapter, and that for me sets the tone for the rest of the book. So yes, I agree with that. And it's been fascinating for me to see putting these different pieces, episodes from different parts of the world, different periods together, and see what kind of story of humans emerges from that. And I find it very moving.
Well, speaking of ancient cave art being a museum of sorts for a collection, I'm going to move over now to Patrick. So in brief, Patrick, this is an amazing story, but you changed places in a way in life. You left the New Yorker for personal reasons, which you may or may you speak about, to take a job as a museum guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you were there for 10 years. And during that time, you were collecting your experiences. And at the end of it, you decided to write a book, which is delightful. So tell us a little bit about how that came to pass.
Sure. First, thank you so much for having me. This is super cool. Thank you, Martin. So yeah, right out of college, I got this job at the New Yorker magazine, not writing, but they're in their events department. But of course, I was 21 years old and I felt like I was on top of the world. I was in a skyscraper at 42nd Street and Broadway. And that's a kind of dangerous way to be thinking, because of course, in fact, I knew nothing about the world. And in fact, I had never written a word of substance, or really even kind of had thought a word of substance yet. But at the New Yorker, of course, I wanted to try to write at first in this sort of sophisticated, urbane style about the arts that the New Yorker is famous for, but I couldn't do it. And that's not really kind of how my mind works anyway. And while I was working there, my brother got ill, as you mentioned, and very ill, a sort of cancer that it was clear at some point he wasn't going to beat. And that meant that I spent much of, 2 years in hospital rooms and sitting by a bedside. And, you notice when you do things like that, that momentous things are kind of happening in this quiet little room right here that in some ways put to shame our attempts to be thinking sophisticated little thoughts in a talk of the town piece for the New Yorker or something like that. And I found it very difficult to sort of leave that world and just go back to an office job where you're thinking about nonsense and trying to climb a corporate ladder and thinking about office politics or whatever the case may be. And I wanted to be someplace where I could just keep my hands empty and have my head up and be thinking my own thoughts kind of on my own time in this beautiful place that in some ways the old master galleries of the Met especially kind of mirror that atmosphere of a quiet little hospital room where there's something very sad but very beautiful and very raw and very stripped down and kind of human and essential. And I wanted to kind of contemplate these things. And I think at the Met, those things are very near and very, you can have an intimate relationship with them.
So there's lots of stuff in the book. There's observation. There's actually an amazing map of the Met. And you take us around all the various galleries. I think there's 500 guards work there at various shifts, half of whom I think are immigrants, which is another amazing thing. So you say right early on, too many visitors think of the Met as a museum of art history where they should learn about art rather than from it. What did you mean by that?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think most of the artists who produced the altarpieces at the Met or, the Egyptian statues or something would find it very peculiar that we are studying these things in some discipline called art history. And we're very interested in schools and styles and techniques and kind of looking at it from an arm's length. Because of course, the person who painted an altarpiece of a lamentation where Christ is in his mother's arms or something like that, imagined that we would be thinking about that. And they imagined we'd be thinking about our own mortality. And we would be thinking about something about the, spiritual dimensions of that story, but also the mystery of the world and the poignancy of human existence and all of these bigger questions. And I think no matter where you wander in the Met, you realize that this is art that's being made by human beings, just like you and I are human beings. And they kind of have, hearts and minds just like we do in large parts. And they are engaging with questions that are still very much alive about, the mystery of why this is all here and why it's so beautiful and why it's so full and why it's so diverse and what to make of the fact that we just live this short span on Earth and we're going to die and what is beautiful and what is joyous and what is sad. And that is what we can do at the Met. We can engage on direct terms with what, as Martin said, all of these peoples of the past have been also meaning making. And we can make our own meaning in a museum, but we can see what others have done with it, both in a spirit of humility, that sort of standing back and taking it all in and feeling small in this great big place. But then at some point too, sort of turning a switch and saying, well, what do I think of this stuff and engage with it as well. That's always what I sort of try to get people to do.
So there's two things going on here in the book. There's all this knowledge that obviously you've accumulated yourself over the course of 10 years being there. And you talk about the ebullient subculture of the museum guards. And then you also eavesdrop on conversations. So you're kind of living between these two worlds in some ways, which I found fascinating. So can you maybe give us some examples of that? I mean, just tell us about your fellow museum guards and some of the people that you heard conversations from.
the cool thing, you work at the New Yorker magazine and everyone has had your similar sort of education. They kind of read books somewhat like you do and movies somewhat you do. And a lot of them, took somewhat more or less straight line into publishing and into their life. But almost nobody takes a straight line to becoming a museum guard. People don't go to school to become a museum guard. So as a result, the people who become guards at the Met is just everybody. It's just everybody. And because so many of them are immigrants, they've had all different lives and all different backgrounds. And they are different styles of human being, in addition to kind of having it's diversity sort of along every axis. And you learn so much from those people. You learn about their home countries, but you also learn about New York. One of this guard, Boris, he's an artist. A ton of the guards are artists. He's very talented, oil painter. And he came to New York in the 1970s. And for decades, he painted flesh tones on department store mannequins. Because just like the ancient Greeks used to have their white statues painted to look realistic, that's what department stores like to do. And then he did that for decades, and that fell out of fashion, and he lost his job, and he's standing on post talking to me. So you just learn so much about the world, which makes sense because you're in a great world museum. And it's sort of what's inspiring about the guards too is they all, they show up to work and they have perfect freedom to think their own thoughts and kind of be whoever they are. If they were a curator, there's something that's sort of channeling their mind into a particular path because they have a certain professional responsibility to, they belong to a certain academic tradition. They're not going to just have a screwball opinion like, Rembrandt's for the birds or something. But as a guard, you can have any opinion you want. And it creates different levels of engagement with the art that are going on. And I felt like it also sort of inspired me to just kind of stand in my own shoes and be who I am and sort of look at the art face to face, mano a mano. And then also you get visitors from all over the world coming in. And many of these visitors, maybe they've not been to the Met before, maybe they've never been to a big art museum at all before, or even a big city before. So, they're asking you for the Mona Lisa, and they're asking you for the dinosaurs and the Constitution and all of those things. And I always loved those people. I loved overhearing conversations and also speaking with people that are just all spun around, because I think they're the ones with their eyes widest. Often if a person is walking through the Met and they kind of feel like they have a bead on art history, they know who Michelangelo was, then they're not necessarily so open at just having new stories just poured into their skull in this place, or they're not so open to, seeing a guy like me standing in a, broken down blue suit and just kind of having a conversation about like, what is this real? This stuff is really Egyptian? And those people, I think, kind of have the right attitude in a way, because we all should feel spun around in a place like the Met. And, Martin's book has all of these stories of all of these cultures from all these tens of thousands of years. And you're like, just my God, none of us can become an expert on more than a tiny, tiny fraction of it. And most people who enter the Met are not interested in becoming experts at all. They're interested in bopping around in all of these different places and having experiences that somehow open their eyes a little wider.
Well, I have to say, you don't strike me as the average museum guard. I go to museums pretty regularly, and most people, I might have gotten this wrong, don't really want to engage. I've had a few conversations with the guards. You must be quite unusual, because there's a point at which in the book you say you go up to this group of teenagers. I think they've got an assignment and they're not quite sure what they're doing. And you end up taking them kind of like on this private tour. Did you see that as part of your function? I mean, you clearly were changing lives.
I would say there are all kinds of museum guards. So there are museum guards that are way chattier than me at the Met, because again, there's more than 500 people. So it just depends. And it's interesting. You kind of determine just by the way you hold yourself and sort of set your face, whether people talk to you or not. if you kind of have, if you're very preoccupied, people don't talk to you. If you're kind of out there, people do talk to you. And yeah, those teenage girls, they had a very good assignment, actually, an assignment that I think is commendable for whoever their teacher was, which the teacher had said, do you think that the that the Greeks believed in their gods? Say why or why not, discussing two works of art. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, because that makes you think, did they believe that there was actually a guy, Zeus, sitting on a mountain, or was it kind of a metaphor, or what was the deal? And I was very happy to kind of help talk them through that assignment, because I think as far as humanities assignment goes, that's quite a good one.
So just about your own knowledge now, in terms of, you had, I guess, a liberal arts education.
I did, yeah. I went to NYU, what's called the Gallatin School, where they let you just take classes in all sorts of departments. So I took a little art history, but mostly I did English, and I did a little religious, and I did some classics, and a humanities potpourri for sure.
And what was it that you would have done differently? What is your take now? You've heard Martin's take about what he's trying to do to make maybe the humanities a bit more relevant, or improved, or whatever, or calling it something different. What is it that's the chief problem from your perspective about the humanities, the way that it's being taught and presented, and why more people aren't signing up, in your view?
Yes, I took some grad school classes as well. And, I was at Hunter College, a public university, and the other people in the class are mostly high school teachers, and these were history classes. And I think across the humanities, you have a problem in that the professors are all PhDs in their subjects, and they have a certain academic cast of mind, and they assume that others are like them, and they sort of are trying to mold future PhDs often. They're trying to get you to think about historiography, and make sure you have the footnotes right, and to have your critical sort of awareness of what's happening in the field. Whereas the reality is that most people who are taking humanities courses, they might not have that cast of mind at all. They might just want to learn about, the Second World War, or they might want to, learn, if they start in an art history course, they want to look at the beautiful cathedrals and temples and mosques that have been created over the course of the world, and sort of sample the majesty of all that, and kind of consider, what does that mean, and how do all these cultures relate to one another, and not necessarily find some specialization and then spend 5 to 7 years of their life, drilling down into some particular, tradition. And in my view, especially the undergraduate humanities and liberal arts should just have the door wide open to a person with that cast of mind, a person that, they should go home to their fellows at the dorm and say, what I do is awesome, because I am an art history major. I go and I sit down in a darkened room. Beautiful things are on the screen. We learn about those beautiful things, and it's nourishing. It sort of makes me feel more alive. It makes me feel more positive about this earth that we live on. And then my professor lets me find some way that I engage in that stuff, lets me find something that I'm interested in about it. And maybe it's a creative project. Maybe it's, maybe I'm writing some grand sweep of an essay that is perhaps far too grandiose to, that a 19-year-old isn't qualified to write, but they need to write those things. Because I can tell you, when I was a 19-year-old, I was very interested in, writing some essay like, this is what, Paradise Lost has to say about, the nature of God and man, like that sort of level of engagement is very important, I think, especially to young people, as opposed to just, nope, let's drill down into how Milton was influenced by such and such.
So it's only fair, I think, even though I've got some more questions for you. And I think you raise a great point there, that I just saw there was an experiment that I think it's in some Scandinavian country they've just started, where they're giving people that have depression 10 free museum passes. And they interviewed this woman that was just walking around. She's one of the recipients, young woman. And and the reporter said, "Why are you here?" And she said, "This space makes me happy. It's as simple as that." And it was such a profound and simple answer. You're pretty much saying the same thing. Is there any further need to reference anything if you're in a space like that? That in itself is nurturing on so many levels. So back to you now, Martin. What's your retort to that critique about how the humanities are being pumped out?
Oh, I 100% agree with everything Patrick has said so beautifully. I mean, I think I used to be like one of Patrick's Hunter College professors and, take all of this for granted and think about the specialization. I really love teaching grad students. And then, I slowly, much too belatedly, realized that that's just the wrong approach. And I think so I had to sort of re-educate myself and retool what I do and how I approach things, both my teaching and writing. And so, no, I mean, I really agree 100% that it's not about producing the next generation of specialists, that I think knowledge matters, and it's important to convey that there are so many things to find out about these objects. So this is not anti-knowledge. And I should also say that on some level, the kinds of book, like the kind of book I just wrote, couldn't have been written without some specialists. It's also not that professors shouldn't specialize at all. On the contrary, it made me actually much more grateful for the world, for the work of specialists. But when it comes to teaching the humanities and communicating why they matter, because enrollments isn't just students not liking their humanities class. It's their parents, it's their uncles, it's their guidance counselors, it's what they pick up from culture more generally. So those are the people you have to convince, and I think we have to get much better at doing it very clearly. And I think Patrick, both his book itself is a beautiful example of doing that, and the way you described that, I think I couldn't agree more.
So, what do places like the Met give us individually and collective? Going back to this thing, you can't quantify a value such as pleasure or enlightenment or joy. What do they give us, and what would we lose? I'll ask you first, Patrick, and then we'll come back to you, Martin, if that was gone from your perspective. Being there day after day after day, seeing how many thousands of people are walking around.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting you said individually and collectively. And I do think the museum has both of those components. I mean, collectively, it's this big sort of bastion of culture where all of New York City or all of Boston or something can show up and engage with this new exhibition that's going on. And it sort of is a sort of, I don't know, it's a bit of permanence in the city. But people also have their own private relationships with museums. And it's unlike other kinds of culture, because, the book I wrote or the book Martin wrote, it sort of takes you on a linear journey. It grabs you by the nose and we're telling them something, and then they're out at the other end of it. And same with a film or same with a play. Whereas a museum, you just show up, you're self-directed, you're on your own. You can spend 2 minutes looking at that painting, or you could spend an hour. You can decide that this wing is for you or that wing is for you. And you build a relationship to this place and you explore in this place. And the nature of art is that you can have very direct experiences. The Greeks, when they met a god, they called that an epiphany, when you saw a god face to face. And in a museum, you're seeing stone and bronze gods, but you can still feel the beauty and the power and the presence. And that's something very different than reading a book where people are just telling you about something. not that books can't make you feel power and presence as well. But if you were to lose that, you would just lose this place of exploration, of sort of intellectual and spiritual and soul exploration that are kind of temples in so many of our cities.
What would you say, Martin?
Yeah, no, that's beautifully said.
That's beautiful.
When you ask about loss, in my mind, I thought, okay, what if it's gone? And I remembered that, if you look at cultural history, the norm is that things get lost. So much gets lost constantly. This is why I emphasize this sort of the institutions like the caves and temples and so on and so forth, and the strange mechanism, the cruel, sort of Darwinian struggle of what gets preserved and how much is lost always. And I think once that really sunk in, and then these rare moments when something is recovered, sometimes after hundreds or thousands of years, these rare moments when, like the volcano buries Pompeii under a coat of ash, but also preserves it. I became obsessed with these kind of almost like time capsules, all the Chauvet caves that get closed up, and that's why they survive. So these rare moments when something from especially the distant past sort of makes it to us, and then perhaps into a museum like the Met or other museums or other places of preservation, a library or other contexts. And so, this in some sense now, when I think about culture, I constantly play in my mind these scenarios of loss and how much gets lost. And it creates such a, feeling of gratitude for these, as I said, rare pieces that survive, and how much accident but also deliberate preservation had to go into each of these pieces being preserved. For example, I have a chapter about a South Asian statue, a tiny statue in Pompeii that was preserved. If not for the volcano, we wouldn't know that. And I try to follow the path of that statue from what is today Afghanistan, all the way to Rome, the Roman Empire. And so these rare moments are really amazing, and it just somehow turned me into a champion of preservation, but also of circulation. So, the Met is such a rich institution. Of course, it's great in New York where lots of people come and, lots of tourists, but there are, of course, hard questions about museums and how objects circulate and where these objects are. And so I think that their museums are confronted with hard questions about that, and rightly so.
Okay, we've got tons of questions coming in from people here. I'm sure we're not going to get to all of them, and I do apologize. It would have to be 3 hours long, this program, to get to all the questions. But
let's do it.
Somebody says, what about the pure pleasure that study of literature, history, and philosophy have? I graduated from Haverford College, the philosophy degree 50 years ago. One of my professors, in an introduction to a book of his essays, wrote of this, the pleasure and joy of thinking, as what attracted him to the study of philosophy to begin with. Then along the way, we discover that knowing how to think is useful in the world, almost whatever we end up doing. So I think that is an amazing point. You can't always see the direct line from A to B of this results in that. It's an enrichment process. And somebody asked you to define cultural sophistication. What would that be, Martin? Have you got a definition for that?
Cultural, it's not a term I'm particularly invested in, but I love what you just relayed the first question as being, and it goes back to the sort of instrumentalist topic that you started us off with. And I think that's so true, that you have to be excited by something as a student, and then you throw yourself into it and you try to understand it, and you try to be good at it. And that has a lot of sort of knock-on benefits. You're more engaged, you learn more, and that then also spills over into maybe other careers. But you've done this thing out of an initial attraction. And so I sometimes try to say this to students, who are worried about this, rightly so, that if if they're passionate about something, they're much more likely to be very good at it and get much more out of it. And that I think, has all kinds of indirect benefits that can be also very practical. So cultural sophistication, I use this term cultural intelligence. I think it's important to understand culture, and especially if you don't have the privilege to travel a lot, which some students may or others may not. It's important to, in some other ways, to get some sense of the enormous varieties of human lives that Patrick also talked so movingly about. And I think humanities provide it. And the varieties in the past is a foreign country. And I think that for me is more important than sophistication in the sense of, being able to rattle off quotes or something. I mean, I'm sure the person who asked the question didn't mean it like that, but the experience of cultural difference, I think, is very important. So that's something I care about.
Somebody had written in, the humanities are what gives us the perspective required to transcend our roles as manipulated consumers. So that's a completely different tack, but it's a very valid one. That it's allowing us to develop parts of ourselves that aren't directly linked with us being a purchaser. We're just being an experiential animal without there being an end product necessarily. And it's somewhat a protection, would you say? You said it frees people up. You had a great definition when we were talking, Patrick, about it makes you a freer thinker, the humanities.
Sure. I mean, I think it's not only, not being manipulated as a consumer or something, but just not be so narrow-minded about anything in particular. Oftentimes there seems to be one conversation going on Twitter or whatever, and everyone is thinking about this one hot button issue. And all you have to do is crack open books or go to a museum to remember, oh my God, the world is enormous. It's absolutely enormous. And there are all different people who are thinking all different things in all different styles. And there are whales in the ocean, and there are stars in the firmament, and there is just so much going on in this universe. And it is not true that the only thing that's interesting right now is this conversation going on the discourse or whatever. So I think it's always a good corrective when you're too in your own head, when you're too in the head of whatever small-minded debate is going on, to just read a book. See, it's a big old world.
Beautifully put. Somebody's asking a question here. Well, actually, there's a lot of questions, but this last person said, what are your thoughts regarding the current notion on some universities and colleges completely eliminating their arts and humanities, social science departments, and fully focusing just on STEM, business, and law? I hadn't heard that.
So, I mean, you have to look what these universities are actually doing. Some are, it's true, eliminating departments, but they're not eliminating courses. Some are consolidating departments, and that is a complicated process. I actually think that sometimes, because I'm become so anti-specialized, hyper-specialization in teaching, that it can actually be better for humanists to have to teach a little more broadly and across the curriculum. And I've also become a big fan of more, general education courses. This is what I now mostly teach, not for humanist specialists. So I wouldn't say just because a university closes down a department that necessarily, that they're necessarily anti these courses. I don't know. It's also true that, that some universities are not supporting the humanities enough. But as I said before, because I feel like we humanists can only change what we do. We can't change the world. I think that if we do a better job at attracting students and making a compelling case, university administrators will follow, because you know what, we're cheap, we humanists. So in some sense, I think university administrators would love to, you know, have us teach lots of students the way we did in the 70s. So yeah, maybe I'm too much blaming ourselves all the time, but that's just sort of how I think. It's always easy to blame someone else.
Somebody's written quite a good answer here. While not everyone will major in humanities, why don't undergrad science programs offer an array of required humanities? It might help them apply their science more ethically. And 2, instead of STEM, why not STEAM? That's pretty clever. I think that's a marvelous idea, because ethics is such an important point. I mean, if we're talking about why we're studying something, and the humanities would hopefully make you a more empathetic, understanding, open individual, one would hope, just because of what you're saying about all the various multitudes of peoples and ideas and thinking and history. It has to enlarge your world rather than limit your world. So if you could insert that into science, it would actually ask you ethical questions about why you're doing what you're doing. Not just, I can do this, but should I do it? Right? Which is ever more important now. Okay, another question. I love the embrace of humanities and taking undergrad courses in these fields, but I would say that humanities are not all about beauty, and as Patrick put it, about being uplifted by the works of humanity. Much of it is very difficult, conflicted, does not always make the student happy. I am currently teaching Uncle Tom's Cabin. The responses there are not of uplift. It's a complex experience to be engaged in the artifacts and expressions of humanity. Good point, good point. But it's definitely enriching all the same. It may not always be uplifting, but you come away with a better understanding of things. Okay, I'm just going to flip back for one sec. I don't mind if we run over here. I personally would find it very difficult, Patrick, to stand on one spot for, I don't know, 2 hours or whatever it is you have to do before you move from gallery to gallery. And it's rather controlled. I don't know how much you say you've got in being stuck where you're stuck. I would have thought not too much. So how did you get over the boredom factor and the physical fatigue?
You stretch a lot. But you know, it's funny. I was never particularly bored. I mean, of course, some days, but you have a very different experience with time when you have an 8 or 12-hour day to just be standing and looking around. I think if you have, 45 minutes to kill, it can feel interminable. But if you have 12 hours to kill, you just have to declare a truce because you know that you're not going to kill it. So you sort of learn how to just exist in that space, and you learn how to use the resources you have. And, a guard told me, when you get bored of the people, you look at the art. When you get bored of the art, you look at the people. You're sort of mining what there is in your own head. You're talking to people, shooting the breeze. But it's almost not something that you can analogize to, if I had to stand there for 1 hour, I would be bored. Well, of course you would be. But if it was 12 hours, it's a little different. You kind of enter a different state. The wavelengths are longer.
And what's one of the best things that happened while you were doing the 10-year stint?
One of the best things? Oh, man. Well, I'll tell you that one of my favorite, one of my good friends there, he's a guard. I call him Joseph in the book. I changed names, but he's a wonderful man, and he's from West Africa, and he just retired. And we were just having a retirement dinner for him, and he is building in his house. He's building himself a house in Ghana where he's going to retire half the year, and he's showing us pictures of this house in Ghana. And I say, Vincent, that's the Moon Gate from the Chinese Scholars Garden at the Met. And his favorite gallery at the Met is the Astor Court, the Chinese Scholars Garden. And, so here's a guy from Chicago and a guy from West Africa talking about a Chinese scholars garden in New York City that he's building in Ghana. And that's just not even, that's the sort of thing that happens all the time. It doesn't even seem that odd, that sort of a experience. So I would say that recent experience was something that hit me here.
That is amazing. That talk about opening up your mind and your world and your cultures. That's a perfect example, isn't it? It transcends everything, the building, your personalities, everything. That's wonderful. So back to these questions again. Oh, what is the future of humanities if continuing on the idea of no specialties?
Yeah, well, I should reiterate what Martin says. I don't have anything against specialists. I mean, of course, specialists are very important, and I don't begrudge anyone who spends 20 years of their life trying to figure out who Velázquez's assistants are or something. Like, that's important. That has value too. What the curators have value. I think what we're both saying is that there's only so many people who have that kind of mind, and for the humanities to thrive, there needs to be larger consideration that many people are generalists, many people are interested amateurs, many people are interested in using this stuff as sort of fuel for something else they're doing, and that we should kind of open the door for all those things.
You anything to add to that, Martin?
No, I totally agree. No.
Okay, so here's a good question. Aren't arts and humanities the way we connect our minds and our hearts to the people who lived so long ago to learn they had the same thoughts and feelings we do? Isn't it comforting and a source of wonder? Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, I would say absolutely. I mean, of course, people who lived a long time ago are also strange. They're both. They're strange and they're relatable. And, if you're in the Met and you walk up to a Greek statue of the Koros made in the archaic age or something, I mean, one thing you will notice is that, that guy's body looks more or less like your body does underneath your clothes. And, this was made by a pair of human hands, and you can kind of see that the human hands made it at that time somewhat awkwardly because they were just kind of figuring out how to depict the nude body in, that part of the Mediterranean at that time. And all of that is very relatable. And, the sun shined in ancient Athens and it's shining today. Like, it wasn't that long in the span of things. But also I will put in the point that one of the reasons to study this stuff too is to come across profound strangeness, where you're like, wow, the ancient Egyptians really thought about death so differently than the way that I think about death. And you can evaluate what you think of, what conclusions, but you also have to realize they had this cultural edifice that shaped them that is so different than the cultural edifice that shapes us. And that is too enriching and makes you have a larger perspective on what's possible in the world.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I mean, when I immerse myself in a distant period or interact with an artwork or a text, I'm constantly thrown back between familiarity and indifference. Because it's true, these were humans, they were exactly, like us, their DNA was exactly like us. And I think we sometimes overemphasize difference. But then the next moment there is something strange that happens. So I find perhaps it's the going back and forth between those positions that is ultimately the most enriching for me. My favorite example of similarity are these fragments from Egyptian scribal schools, where you have students complaining about their teachers. My teacher beat me. My teacher, is too hard on me. Doesn't understand, how difficult it is to a student. And then you have teachers, and this is from 3,000 years ago, teachers saying, this generation of students no longer really cares about the arts and humanities. I mean, they don't say arts and humanities, but it's essentially this, it's almost like they show the statistics, Mary, with which you got us started. And so you're like, oh my God, this could be written today, so that.
All right, I'm going to run over because there's two very good questions here. They're very different. Patrick, this woman, Elizabeth Wallace, asks you a question. I took the museum hack boot camp, discovered the Met and me in the Met in a very unusual, unique way. If you're familiar with museum hack, do you think it would be a good way for more students to discover the Met by creating their own tours?
Sure. Yeah, I'm familiar with museum hack. I think the pandemic might have killed them off. I don't know. But yes, I'm giving tours of the Met too these days, and walking people through the Met and doing it from a sort of perspective, and having sort of a story to tell and a narrative to thread through as you are walking amongst the galleries is, of course, a wonderful way to do it, because it sort of incorporates storytelling, and people feel like they have a frame of reference for coming to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So yeah, I've found that to be a very successful way at engaging people for sure.
Okay, another question. Could our speakers comment on the relation of money, profit, to the enjoyment and appreciation of cultural phenomena? Do we have to try and ignore it? Interesting.
I certainly don't think we should ignore it. I mean, there's a lot of money always involved. It's not just money. I mean, it's interesting, especially if you look at ancient cultures, any act of preserving something required enormous, financial resources, which to copy manuscripts, to preserve something. So I think there's always, societies make value judgment and decide what is valuable and what is not valuable. And, in our capitalist economy, that's also the case. So yeah, I think money absolutely plays a role, especially if you start to, as I try to do, trace, to come back to the South Asian statue, to Rome. Rome was buying all the stuff from the East, so much so that there's actually a trade imbalance between Rome and the East. All these Roman coins are found in India and in Afghanistan and so on and so forth. So, trade.
I wonder if she was referring to access to culture, like who can actually avail themselves of culture, entry to spaces. I don't know if she means that. I don't know if the Met is free on certain nights, like MoMA is.
So the Met, you can pay whatever you will if you're a New Yorker. It used to be anyone can pay whatever they will, and unfortunately that's done away with. But I do tell people, people ask you as a guard, how much is this? How much is this worth? And you can't answer that question, and not just for sort of a Pollyanna reason, like, oh, this is priceless. But it's because the reason why things that go onto the art market have these crazy inflated prices is because most stuff does not come onto the art market because it's in public collections. It belongs to all of us. And even if you have to pay your, $30 to get into the Met, you have at the Met access to a collection that makes, JP Morgan or anyone else's collection that's just the table scraps of the great public collections. And I do think that it is something, to be proud of. One of my favorite guards, I asked him why he became a guard at the Met. And he said, well, the only thing I've ever wanted to be is an independently wealthy patron of the arts. And this comes closest. And I think we could all kind of feel that way sometimes. Go into that museum like you own the place, and you do own the place. It's all right there for you to look at. The trustees don't get to touch the art, just like you don't get to. Believe me.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Okay, last question, because we've gone over. Do you mind doing another question?
No.
Harkening back to where the humanities arts need to convince people around the students that humanities is relevant and important, how would you convince students who are already taking humanities courses, but perhaps loathe key elements to be more receptive to these elements, such as poetry, art, or even the act of reading? Running into many intelligent people now who hate to read, how to approach making humanities relevant to someone already dealing with the field? Gosh, that's a big question. So how do we make it more relevant? I don't know. What do you think, Martin, and then Patrick?
I'm trying to fully understand the question. So students who don't want to read, there are lots of other arts and humanities. I mean, you have to read always, but I don't quite know what that means. But there are lots of visual humanities. I have a background in theater. I'm always struck by the fact that the students who gravitate towards theater and dance aren't necessarily as big readers or exercise very other faculties and activities in doing the arts. So I think that to suggest that you have to be a big. I, for example, was not a big reader as a teenager at all. I came to the humanities through philosophy. Yes, that's reading, but only then sort of gravitated into literature. So I don't think that the humanities are for the people who have always been big readers necessarily. I wouldn't restrict it to that. There's so much to be discovered. Arts, cultures, different people, different times.
So lots on audio now. So much of material is on audio.
Also true.
You don't even have to read it.
Also true. Yeah.
A last comment from you, Patrick, on that. Have you got anything to add to that mix?
Sure. I mean, I think it goes back to what we've been saying, that people are different, I mean, there's not a one size fits all way to engage with a student and try to get them to love something or put their heart into it or engage with it. The person who said it's not all uplifting, that's absolutely true. I mean, maybe you're trying to get someone to struggle with something, to empathize with something. And, different strategies are going to have to be employed with different people, because somebody might be intensely interested in thick tones, and some people, like Martin said, might be transported sitting in a theater. And the lights go down and the lights go up, and that is the magic for them. And it's not so much being in a quiet room with a book. And of course, the humanities isn't going to be for everyone as a major. So it's always going to be a fight. You're always going to have to find the different angles.
Well, there's 2 points before we close that people have made here. I'd love you to make the point that humanities will help us get along with each other and collaborate in both politics and STEM. Good point well taken. Perhaps we are fretting too much about undergraduates. Learning is lifelong. I loved my philosophy courses as an undergrad, but it was not realistic majoring. After retiring as a physician scientist, I've been taking many courses, all in the humanities, in adult education. Many of my classmates are taking these courses for the same reasons, to enrich our lives and make up for lost time training for or focusing on our careers. The memories of my undergrad humanities professors continue to inspire. Whoa, that's a wonderful tribute.
Yes, I think that's a wonderful point. It's a wonderful point that, I found myself, I mentioned I was friends with that guard who was close to retirement. I was very frequently friends with the old timers because, you reach a point in life where you've experienced things and you know who you are, but also maybe your ego has been, brushed away by various hardships you've had in your life, and you're open to learning, and you don't have any pretensions. And those people are obviously the most wonderful students of things like the arts in a museum, because they can connect it with things in their life. They have texture to the way that they relate to these things. And no, that's a wonderful point, that it's not just undergraduates we should be worrying about.
It's a very uplifting point too. I think that we can continue to do this forever while we draw breath. Wow. Well, this has been an amazing discussion. We really didn't get to a fraction of the numbers of questions. I think it's a topic that concerns many of us. And I think we're all concerned about our humanity and preserving it and enlarging it, not limiting it. And I think, the arts do a wonderful job at that, keeping us open-minded. So I want to thank Martin Puchner and Patrick Bringley for sharing their wonderful insights today and their hard work in producing their books, which, you should try and get copies of. If you can't buy them, you can always order them from your libraries. Cambridge Forum is made possible by the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, Cambridge Community Foundation, and you. So if you haven't given us anything in a while, you can step up and donate via the website, but you can also sign up for free updates, all at www.cambridgeforum.org. If you haven't seen the podcasts that we have online, we've got a whole collection of past forums and podcasts, video links, and a great big classic collection of our archived recordings. We produce weekly broadcasts of Cambridge Forum for NPR, which you can also access, and GBH are recording this today. Thanks everybody for joining us today and enriching the discussion. We look forward to seeing you all on Valentine's Day for the next forum. Thank you again, gentlemen, and thank you all for joining.